The SEBI Listing Obligations and Disclosure Requirements Regulations 2015 R Euros, universally called SEBI LODR Euro, is the single most important regulatory framework governing every listed entity in India. It rewired how companies disclose, how boards function, and how shareholders are protected. SEBI LODR replaced the old listing agreement that existed under Section 21 of the Securities Contracts Regulation Act 1956. Before 2015, every listed company signed a separate listing agreement with each stock exchange. SEBI LODR unified everything into one regulation with statutory force under the SEBI Act 1992. Regulation 2 of SEBI LODR defines the scope. A listed entity means an entity which has listed any of its securities on a recognized stock exchange. This includes equity shares, preference shares, debentures, bonds, and any other securities recognized by SEBI. The moment you list, LODR applies. SEBI LODR applies to entities listed on the main board of BSE, NSE, or any recognized stock exchange. It also applies to entities listed on the SME platform and the Innovators Growth platform, though with certain relaxations and modified thresholds for smaller companies. Regulation 3 of SEBI LODR lays down the governing principles. A listed entity must abide by the spirit of the law and not merely the letter. It must act in a manner that protects the interests of all stakeholders, shareholders, employees, creditors, and the public at large. This is the foundational philosophy of LODR. LODR is structured into chapters and schedules. Chapters I and II cover preliminary definitions and principles. Chapters 3 to IX cover specific obligations euro, from board composition to financial results, from shareholder meetings to corporate governance. Schedules A through D contain the actual formats for disclosures. Chapter 3 of LODR contains the common obligations applicable to all listed entities. These include the obligation to ensure compliance by the listed entity and its directors, officers, and employees. The compliance officer euro, typically the company secretary euro, is the designated point of contact between the company and the stock exchange. Under Regulation 6, every listed entity must appoint a qualified company secretary as its compliance officer. This person is responsible for monitoring compliance, filing reports, and acting as the bridge between the board and the exchange. If the compliance officer resigns, the company must notify the exchange within 24 hours. Regulation 7 requires every listed entity to appoint a share transfer agent. For companies that handle their own share transfers in-house, the in-house facility must be equivalent to that of a registered transfer agent. The RTA or in-house facility handles all share transfers, transmissions, and investor correspondence within the timelines mandated by SEBI. Regulation 9 mandates that every listed entity must have a functional website. But LODR does not stop at having a website euro, it specifies exactly what must be displayed. The terms and conditions of the appointment of independent directors, the code of conduct, the whistleblower policy, the policy on materiality of related party transactions, and the details of the compliance officer must all be published and kept current on the website. The website must also host the financial results euro, quarterly and annual euro, for a period of at least 5 years. This is not optional. If your financial results are not on the website, you are non-compliant with Regulation 46. One critical misconception: LODR compliance is not a once-a-year exercise. It is a continuous obligation running 365 days a year. Every material event must be disclosed as and when it occurs, not bundled into the next quarterly filing. This shift from periodic to continuous compliance was the single biggest cultural change LODR brought to Indian corporate governance. LODR applies differently to different categories of listed entities. The top 1,000 listed entities by market capitalization face the most rigorous compliance requirements. Entities ranked 1001 to 2000 have slightly relaxed norms. Entities below the top 2000 have further exemptions, particularly around the composition of board committees and the frequency of meetings. For the top 1000 entities, Regulation 17 mandates that at least 50% of the board must comprise non-executive directors. When the chairperson is an executive director, at least half the board must be independent directors. If the chairperson is a non-executive director, at least 1/3 must be independent. These percentages are non-negotiable. LOD also governs the gap between board meetings. Regulation 17 says that the board must meet at least 4 times a year, with a maximum gap of 120 days between any 2 meetings. For the top 1,000 entities, at least 4 meetings a year, and for the top 2,000, at least 4 meetings. Smaller entities follow the Companies Act requirement of 4 meetings with a 120-day cap. Regulation 15 serves as the applicability gateway. It tells you which regulations apply to which category of entity. For example, Regulation 17 to 27 AI Euros, the corporate governance provisions A Euros, apply to the top 2,000 listed entities on a mandatory basis. Entities below the top 2,000 must comply with the spirit of these provisions on a voluntary basis. A crucial feature of LODR is the deemed applicability principle. Even if a specific regulation does not mandatorily apply to your entity size, if it is triggered by the facts a euro, such as a material subsidiary acquisition or a related party transaction a euro, you must comply as if the regulation applied. Facts on the ground override the size-based exemption. Regulation 34 requires every listed entity to produce an annual report. The annual report must contain the board's report, the management discussion and analysis, the corporate governance report, the business responsibility and sustainability report, and the financial statements a euros, all within the statutory timelines. For the top 1,000 entities, the annual report must be sent to shareholders at least 21 days before the AGM. LODR also integrates with other SEBI regulations. The SEBI Insider Trading Regulations, the SEBI Takeover Code, and the SEBI Delisting Regulations all interact with LODR disclosures. For instance, a disclosure under LODR Regulation 30 about a major acquisition may simultaneously trigger obligations under the Takeover Code if it crosses the 25% threshold. Regulation 4 specifically addresses the obligation of the listed entity towards stakeholders. The listed entity must ensure that adequate steps are taken for expeditious redressal of investor complaints. It must also cooperate with the recognized stock exchanges and depositories in their oversight function. Every listed entity has a duty to facilitate supervision. The concept of material subsidiary is another LODR innovation. Regulation 16 defines a material subsidiary as one whose income or net worth exceeds 20% of the consolidated income or net worth of the listed entity. Once a subsidiary crosses this threshold, it triggers a cascade of additional governance requirements A euros, including an independent director on its board from the listed entity. SEBI LODR also introduces the concept of listed entity disclosure compliance under Regulation 13. Every listed entity must ensure that all statements made in its disclosures are factually accurate and not misleading. The obligation extends to press releases, investor presentations, analyst calls, and even media interviews. Any statement made anywhere that could influence investor decisions must be consistent with the formal regulatory filing. Regulation 30 is the beating heart of continuous disclosure under LODR. It requires every listed entity to disclose to the stock exchange any event or information that is material a euro, meaning it is likely to affect the price of the securities. The disclosure must be made as soon as reasonably possible, and in any case not later than 24 hours from the occurrence of the event. Schedule 3 of LODR lists the specific events that are deemed material. Part A lists events that must be disclosed without any application of materiality guidelines a euros, such as a change in control, a fraud by the company, or a rating revision. Part B lists events where materiality applies a euros, such as litigation, a labor dispute, or an acquisition beyond a threshold. Regulation 31 requires the listed entity to submit a compliance certificate to the stock exchange, signed by the compliance officer and authorized by the board, confirming that all LODR provisions have been complied with. This certificate must be submitted within 60 days from the end of each quarter. It is a formal attestation that everything is in order a euro, or a disclosure of what is not. One of the most powerful tools under LODR is the power of SEBI to seek information. Under Regulation 97, SEBI can call for any information, record, or document from any listed entity at any time. There is no requirement of pending investigation. If SEBI asks, you must respond a euro fully, accurately, and within the timeline specified. The Board of Directors carries the ultimate responsibility for LODR compliance. Under Regulation 4, the board must ensure that the listed entity has an adequate and effective compliance framework. This is not a task the board can delegate to the compliance officer and forget. The board must actively oversee, periodically review, and satisfy itself that the framework is working. SEBI has consistently increased its enforcement appetite under LR. The SEBI board meeting of September 2023 approved amendments to significantly raise monetary penalties. Fines for non-compliance that were once measured in lakhs are now measured in crores. The message is clear. Compliance is cheaper than non-compliance. SEBI LODR is not static. It is amended regularly through SEBI board meetings and circulars. Since its inception in 2015, LODR has seen more than 30 amendments. Each amendment addresses a gap discovered through market experience or enforcement cases. Companies that fall behind on LODR amendments risk non-compliance simply through ignorance. To practically manage LOR compliance, every listed entity needs three things: a compliance calendar that maps every filing deadline across the year, a disclosure policy that defines what is material and who decides, and a quarterly compliance review before the board that verifies every obligation has been met. The company secretary is the architect of this system, but the board is its owner. The future of LODR is moving toward real-time machine-readable disclosures. SEBI has already mandated XBR filing for financial results. The next frontier is API-based direct reporting, where stock exchanges can pull compliance data from company systems in real time. Companies that build their compliance infrastructure today will find tomorrow's transition seamless. SEBI LODR is not just a regulation or euro. It is the contract between Indian-listed companies and the public that invests in them. It is the framework that makes Indian markets worthy of trust. Every clause, every deadline, and every disclosure is a brick in the wall of market integrity. Understand it, implement it, and never treat it as optional or a euro, because it is not.